She ran barefoot down the alley behind Seoul's most luxurious hotel. Her mascara smudged, her evening gown torn, her heart shattered. And then she fell into the arms of a stranger standing in the rain. She cried. She begged. She didn't know she had just embraced the man whose name struck fear into all of Seoul. Kang Min-jae, the city's most powerful tycoon, who had buried his emotions for 3 years, tonight for the first time, was captivated by a woman he couldn't leave. If you're reading this story, please like and comment with your city name, so I know how far my story has come. The rain hit Seoul like something with a grudge, not the soft, cinematic kind that makes city lights blur into watercolors. This was cold, relentless, the sort of rain that soaks through wool coats in under a minute and turns alley pavement into something treacherous. It came down hard off the Han River corridor and punished everything beneath it. The neon signs, the garbage bins, the clusters of drunk salarymen stumbling between bars, the black sedans idling outside the Riverside Grand Hotel with their engines running and their drivers pretending not to exist. Yoon Ji-ah felt none of it. She was already numb before she hit the alley. The cold registered somewhere at the edge of her awareness, a distant fact like traffic noise or a television in another room, but her body had stopped processing ordinary sensation approximately 40 minutes ago in a penthouse suite on the 32nd floor of that hotel when she pushed open a door that wasn't meant for her and discovered that her entire life had been constructed out of someone else's convenience. She was running without knowing she was running. Her heels were somewhere back on the 32nd floor. She'd kicked them off in the elevator before she even understood what she was doing, before her legs decided that standing still in that building for one more second was not something her body was willing to do. The marble lobby floor had been cold under her feet. The pavement out here was wet and gritty, and she could feel small pieces of gravel pressing into the arches of her feet as she moved, and she didn't care. The pain was information. The pain meant she was still inside her own body, which was not something she'd felt certain of in the elevator on the way down. The alley behind the Riverside Grand ran between 2 high-rises and smelled like rain and kitchen exhaust from the hotel's service entrance. Emergency exit lights threw red shapes across the wet ground. Ji-ah was moving fast, but not in any particular direction. Her body was just putting distance between itself and that room, that face. That particular silence that falls when a woman realizes the man who proposed to her 8 months ago looked at her like she was an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a person to be devastated. He hadn't even looked ashamed. That was the thing. Lim Sung-woo had looked across that suite, past the woman in his lap who was quickly gathering a robe around herself, and his expression had been one of mild calculation, like a man doing math in his head, like he was already 2 steps ahead of this moment, already managing the fallout. "Ji-ah," he'd said, calm, almost gentle. "Don't do anything that makes this worse." She'd stood there with one hand on the doorframe and her engagement ring catching the light from the bedside lamp, and something inside her chest had made a sound she didn't hear so much as feel. A deep structural crack, the kind that happens in old buildings before the ceiling comes down. She had run. Now she was in an alley with no shoes in the rain, and her phone was somewhere in her clutch, and she hadn't opened the clutch yet because opening the clutch meant confronting the calls that were already coming in. Sung-woo's chief of security, Sung-woo's personal assistant. Probably Sung-woo himself by now, voice smooth and reasonable, explaining to her exactly how she was going to behave for the next 72 hours until the public optics could be managed. She stopped walking. Not because she intended to. Her legs just quit. She stood in the middle of the alley and pressed both palms flat against the brick wall to her left and leaned her weight into it and breathed in hard, fast gulps of cold air that tasted like rain and exhaust and soul. Her mascara was running. She could feel it on her cheeks, feel the way cold air stung the tracked lines of it. Her hair had come half down from the French twist the stylist had spent 40 minutes constructing that afternoon. The emerald silk gown she'd paid, no, that her mother had paid, from the clothing allowance the Lim family provided. Everything in her life was paid for by someone with expectations attached. The gown was soaked through at the hem, and there was a 6-inch tear along the side seam from where she'd half fallen getting out of the service exit. She had nowhere to go. That was the thought that finally arrived with its full weight. Not the betrayal, not the rage, not the humiliation. Those were all still there, circling. But underneath them was this simple, devastating fact. She had nowhere to go. Her apartment lease was in Sung-woo's family's name. Her position at the Lim Foundation for Cultural Heritage came with the engagement. Her family's home in Mapogu had been quietly refinanced 3 years ago under arrangements she hadn't fully understood at the time, and still didn't, not completely, not in the ways that would have mattered. Every structure of her life had been constructed by other people, and she had walked into each room of it believing she was choosing. The sob that came out of her wasn't the pretty kind. It wasn't movie crying. It was ugly and involuntary and came from somewhere below her ribs, and she pressed her forehead against the wet brick wall and let it happen because there was nothing else to do. She didn't hear him. She didn't hear anything over the rain and the sound of her own breathing. She just straightened up after a few seconds, pushed herself off the wall, and walked forward because standing still felt worse. And then she turned the corner at the end of the alley toward the narrow service lane that ran behind the club district, and she walked directly into someone. She didn't bounce back. She didn't stumble. She collapsed into him. It was pure physical failure. Legs giving out, body pitching forward, hands grabbing the only solid thing available. Her fingers found wool. Dense, quality wool. A coat or an overcoat. Something structured. Her face hit a chest that was harder than she expected. She grabbed 2 fistfuls of the fabric, and the sob came out of her again before she could stop it, broken and childlike and completely beyond her control. I can't do this anymore. She didn't know she was going to say it until it was already in the air. I can't keep doing this. The man did not move. Not away, not toward her, not even a reflexive step backward. He stood completely still in the rain, one arm at his side, and let her hold on. Later, she would try to reconstruct what his stillness felt like. Not cold exactly, not indifferent. More like the stillness of something that had decided it wasn't going anywhere. Like a wall you could lean against. Like the space inside the eye of a storm where nothing is moving because everything is already moving around it. She cried for maybe 30 seconds, hard, ragged, everything at once. And then something made her lift her head. She became aware of several things simultaneously. The first was the rain, which continued to fall on both of them with complete impartiality. The second was that somewhere behind her, she could hear the low rumble of engines, multiple engines, and that the sound had stopped. The third was that the man she was clutching had very dark eyes and was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not shock, not discomfort. Something more complicated than either. The fourth was that the engines she'd heard were attached to 3 black sedans that had materialized at each end of the service lane and were now sitting there, headlights on, rain streaking through the beams, completely still. And the fifth was that there were men standing in the rain beside those sedans. Large men in dark clothing with earpieces. Security, she thought automatically. She'd spent enough time around Sung-woo's detail to recognize the posture. But these men weren't moving toward her. They weren't moving at all. They were standing in the rain with the doors open and their hands visible and looking at the man she was holding on to with expressions that were unmistakably deferential. Ji-ah took 1 step backward. The man led her. He didn't reach out to stop her. He just stood there in his black overcoat with rain collecting on his shoulders and looked at her. And in the light spilling from the service entrance behind her, she could see him more clearly now. He was perhaps 35, clean-shaved. The kind of face that could pass for unremarkable until you looked at it directly, at which point something about the geometry of it became difficult to look away from. He was tall, not Sung-woo's performative athlete tall, just quietly, genuinely tall. He wore the overcoat well, the way men wear things when they don't think about wearing them. His hands were at his sides. There was a scar along the edge of his left jaw, faint and old, and his knuckles were scarred in a way that spoke to a history he probably didn't explain often. What made Ji-ah's pulse stutter wasn't any of this. It was the sedans. It was the men in the rain holding perfectly still. It was the specific quality of their stillness, which was not the stillness of men waiting for orders, but the stillness of men who had immediately, instinctively frozen because they recognized that the person standing in front of them was not someone who wanted to be approached right now. "Who are you?" Ji-ah's voice came out smaller than she intended. The man said nothing for a moment, then, "You're barefoot." It was not an answer to her question. "I know." She looked down at her feet, pavement, puddles, grit, looked back up. "Who are you?" "Someone who wasn't expecting company." "Those are your cars." "Yes." "And those men?" "Also mine." Something inside her chest made a different kind of movement than the crack from earlier. This one was quieter, more careful. The particular internal rearrangement that happens when a body understands something the mind hasn't finished processing yet. "I need to leave," she said. "I need to—" She stopped, because she still had nowhere to go. The honest answer to "I need to leave" was "I don't know where." Something moved in his face, almost nothing. But almost nothing in a face that had been completely still was significant. "Tell me who you're running from," he said. Specifically, I'm not running from anyone." His eyes moved to her feet, then back to her face. He didn't say anything. Ji-ah's throat tightened. "I don't know you." "No." "So I'm not telling you anything." "That's reasonable." He said it like he genuinely meant it, which was disorienting. Sungwoo's circle didn't do reasonable. Sungwoo's circle did smooth, and it did pressure, and it did the particular kind of social grace that functioned as a trap. This man's voice had none of that. It was flat in a way that felt honest. "Are you injured?" "What?" "Are you injured? Your feet? Your—" A slight pause. "You're bleeding. Left foot." She looked down. He was right. Somewhere in the alley she'd picked up a cut on her left heel. Small, but bleeding clearly enough that rain was diluting it pink across the pavement under her foot. She hadn't felt it until he named it. Now she felt it. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not, but I'm not going to argue about it." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a folded handkerchief. Actual cloth, not paper, white and clean and slightly absurd in its formality, and held it out to her. Ji-ah stared at it. She did not take it. "What do you want?" she asked. "Nothing from you." He kept his hand extended with the handkerchief, patient. "I was standing here. You ran into me. People don't just stand in alleys in the rain." "I do." "Why?" He was quiet for a second. "Sometimes I need to be somewhere I'm not expected to be." She looked at the handkerchief. She looked at the sedans. She looked at the men in the rain who were still not moving, who were giving the two of them a radius of space that felt deliberately maintained. And she thought about Sungwoo's face when he'd looked at her across that suite, the calculations happening behind his eyes, the smoothness of him, even then. This man was not smooth. She took the handkerchief. He watched her press it against her heel and didn't comment. Then he said, "There's a car. I can take you wherever you need to go." "I don't need—" "You have no shoes. It's raining. And whoever is looking for you right now—" He paused. "They're looking." Ji-ah went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What do you mean, whoever is looking for me?" 3 vehicles have made 2 passes through this block in the last 6 minutes. Different plates, but same model sedan, same tinted windows. His voice was completely even. "I notice things. I've noticed them. They haven't found you yet." The handkerchief in her hand was darkening with rain. Ji-ah thought about Sungwoo's security team. His chief of security, Baek Jae-hyun, who had the kind of face that looked politely blank at all times and made her uncomfortable in a way she'd never fully articulated. She thought about the calls she hadn't answered. She thought about the way Sungwoo had said, "Don't do anything that makes this worse," with that particular cadence that people used when they were describing consequences they'd already planned rather than ones they were improvising. She had left the engagement party she was supposed to be photographed at for 3 hours. The annual Lim Foundation benefit gala. 200 guests. Press coverage. The announcement of the new cultural endowment she was supposed to smile through. She had just become a problem someone needed to contain. "Where would you take me?" she said. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere they're not." "That's not specific." "No." "You still haven't told me your name." The rain fell. One of the sedans further down the lane had its engine idling with that particular low frequency that expensive German cars produced, and in the distance, Ji-ah could hear the city. Traffic, music from somewhere, a siren starting and stopping. All of it normal, all of it indifferent to what was happening in this narrow wet lane between two buildings. Kang, he said. Min-jae. The name hit her like stepping off a curb you didn't see. She had heard that name exactly 3 times in her life, and each time it had been spoken in the same specific register. Low, careful, with a slight pause before and after, the way you handled fragile objects or hot things. Once from her father, years ago, before the prosecution case that had destroyed him. Once from Baek Jae-hyun, Sung-woo's security chief, during a terse conversation she wasn't supposed to have overheard. And once from a federal investigator who had come to her apartment in New York and explained with bureaucratic gentleness that a man she knew as Michael Kang was the subject of a significant organized crime investigation and that her cooperation would be both voluntary and appreciated. She took one step backward, and then the thing she'd been trying not to know arrived fully in her mind. The overcoat, the stillness, the quality of the waiting, the 3 sedans and the men in the rain who moved like they'd been trained to move by someone who never needed to explain himself twice. The particular way powerful men occupied space, which she had learned to recognize in Sung-woo's orbit, but this was different. Sung-woo occupied space like a man who had bought the rights to it. This man occupied space like it had always already been his. 3 years ago, she had cried on a stranger's chest in a New York hotel bar after a client dinner that had gone badly sideways, and a man had handed her a drink without asking what was wrong and talked to her for 2 hours about art restoration theory, and she had left that conversation feeling, for the first time in months, like an actual person. 6 months later, she had discovered that conversation was with Kang Min-jae, the invisible king of Seoul's criminal syndicates, who controlled the port authorities and 3 of the city's largest legitimate corporations from behind the kind of multi-layered legal architecture that took federal investigators years to begin to untangle, whose name prosecutors whispered like they were acknowledging weather, whose organization had survived 14 years of attempted disruption by law enforcement agencies on 2 continents. He was also the man who had, for 6 months in New York, called himself Michael, and listened when she spoke, and never once made her feel like a liability. She hadn't spoken to him since the day she disappeared from his life without explanation. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. "I know," he said. "You knew who I was, before, when I ran into you." A pause. Half a second, maybe less. "Yes." The rain was unrelenting. Ji-ah's soaked gown was heavy against her legs. Her left heel was aching now that she was aware of it, and the handkerchief was doing very little against the rain. Down the lane, one of the black sedans inched slightly forward. She should run. Her body didn't move. "Why were you standing here?" she said. "Specifically here. Specifically tonight." He looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes and said nothing. "You followed me." I was already in the building." He said it like it was a smaller fact than it was. "Why?" Silence again. But different this time. The silence of someone deciding how much truth to offer. "There are things happening around the Lim Foundation," he said finally, "that I've been watching for some time. Tonight I was here to see who showed up for the gala." He paused. "You showing up in this alley was not part of what I was expecting." Ji-ah thought about the Art Foundation, her position as senior preservation consultant, which she had earned legitimately. The only thing in her current life she had genuinely earned, and which she had been quietly proud of in the way you're proud of things you don't talk about because other people will find a way to take the credit. The account access code she used for the Foundation's international transfer authorizations. The offshore art acquisition account she'd flagged twice to her supervisor as irregularly structured and been told both times to process them anyway. She thought about the look on Baek Jae-hyun's face during that conversation she'd overheard. Not quite worry, something more operational than worry. "What kinds of things?" she said. Min-jae looked at her for a moment. The 3 sedans sat in the rain. The men stood still. "Come out of the rain," he said. "I'll explain what I can." Why would I get in a car with you? Because Sung Woo's team just turned onto the north end of this block. His voice was completely calm. And you have about 90 seconds. Ji-ah turned. At the far end of the service lane, headlights had appeared, moving slowly, the way cars moved when they were searching for something. Everything in her went very quiet. She looked at the man in front of her, the man she had spent 3 years trying not to think about, the man whose real name had dismantled the careful structure she'd built around those 6 months in New York, the man about whom she knew enough to be genuinely afraid. Not the social kind of afraid, not the kind you felt around powerful men who could hurt your career, but the real kind. The kind with physical foundations. She also knew, in the particular wordless way bodies know things, that the men in the sedans behind her would step in front of a bullet for him without instruction. That the space she was standing in right now was the safest space within 300 meters. She also knew that might be the most dangerous conclusion she'd ever come to. The headlights at the north end of the lane were getting closer. Ji-ah, he said. Just her name. Quietly. The last time she'd heard him say her name, her real name, not the careful half-fiction she'd been living inside, had been in a New York apartment with morning light through the window, and she had been still half asleep, and everything had felt like a different world. She looked at the headlights. She looked at him. Her feet, without her explicit instruction, moved toward his car. He said nothing. He simply walked beside her, and one of the sedan's rear doors opened from the inside before either of them reached it, and the rain kept falling on Seoul like a thing that had made up its mind. Inside the car, the leather was warm and the windows were dark, and Ji-ah sat with the ruined handkerchief in both hands and stared forward and breathed. Min-jae got in on the other side and pulled the door closed, and the sedan moved. You said you'd explain, Ji-ah said. I will. You said what's happening around the foundation. Yes. She turned and looked at him directly in the low light. How bad is it? He didn't look at her. He looked at the passing city through the tinted glass, and the reflection of Seoul's lights moved across his face, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of a man choosing between two versions of an answer. Bad enough, he said, that tonight wasn't an accident. Ji-ah's hands tightened on the ruined cloth. What does that mean? The car moved through wet streets and the city slid past outside, and Min-jae turned his head and looked at her with that dark, complicated expression that she had spent 3 years trying to categorize and never managed to. It means, he said, that you didn't run into me by chance. The car turned north. The headlights of Sung-woo's sedans vanished behind them. And somewhere in the warm, dark interior of that vehicle, Yoon Ji-ah understood that the life she'd been living was already over, and that whatever was beginning right now in this rain-slicked Seoul night, moving fast through a city full of powerful men with things to hide, was something she had not been prepared for. She gripped the handkerchief. Outside, the Han River caught the city lights and threw them back at the sky, silver and trembling, like a mirror that had almost remembered someone's face. The estate sat on the northern edge of Seoul's Gangbuk district, behind walls that didn't announce themselves. That was the first thing Ji-ah noticed. Most wealthy men built walls that said something, gates with crests, stone pillars, lighting designed to imply arrival. The entrance here was set back from the road behind a curve of old-growth trees, and the gate was matte black and flush with the surrounding wall, and did not, in any way, invite you to look at it. You had to know it was there. Ji-ah had driven past this particular stretch of road approximately a dozen times over the years. It ran parallel to the Northern Han River Trail, and she'd used it as a shortcut during her tenure at the Cultural Foundation. And she had never once registered that something existed behind the tree line, which was, she understood now, entirely the point. The sedan passed through the gate, and the gate closed behind it with a sound like a conversation ending. The grounds were dark, except for low lighting buried in the gravel path, and the main house came into view as the path curved. Not the glass and steel monument she'd half expected, but something older, a renovation of a traditional Korean estate that had been updated with brutal restraint. Stone, dark wood, deep overhanging eaves, the kind of architecture that had given up trying to impress people. There were men at the entrance, not many, but positioned correctly, and they moved the way people moved when movement was their actual profession rather than an affectation. They looked at Min-jae with the specific attentiveness of people whose primary job was to ensure he remained alive. They did not look at Ji-ah with anything she could interpret cleanly. Inside, the house was warm and quiet. Wooden floors, low furniture, art that wasn't decorative, actual pieces, a few of which she recognized. A Choi Wook-young canvas near the entrance that made her stop walking for a half-second before she caught herself. A woman in her 50s appeared from a side corridor. Short hair, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, an expression of concentrated practicality. "Dr. Yoon needs shoes," Min-jae said, "and a change of clothes if there's anything suitable. And the northeast sitting room." The woman, no introduction offered or requested, looked at Ji-ah's feet, looked at the trail of faint, wet prints she'd left across the entrance floor, and nodded. She disappeared. Ji-ah stood in the entry hall of Kang Min-jae's private residence with a ruined handkerchief and no shoes and said, "I haven't agreed to anything." "I know." He was already moving down the corridor. "I said I'd hear an explanation. That's all I said." "I know." He didn't slow down. "The sitting room's warmer." She followed him. Not because she'd decided to exactly. More because standing alone in an unfamiliar hallway seemed like the worst option out of available options, which was becoming a theme of the evening. The northeast sitting room was what it claimed to be. A room with 2 low couches and a table and a window that showed nothing but dark tree shapes and rain. A small fire had been built in the hearth, which either meant it had been prepared in advance or there was someone on staff whose entire job was anticipating what Min-jae needed before he needed it. Ji-ah suspected the latter. He poured water from a carafe on the side table. He set the glass in front of her. He sat down across the table from her and did not pour one for himself and looked at her with that expression she still couldn't name. "Talk," she said. "The Lim Foundation." "What about it?" "It's a laundry." He said it the way you said the weather. "Has been for at least 9 years. The art acquisition accounts you process authorizations for. The irregularly structured ones you flagged twice and were told to process anyway." He paused. Watched her. "The money moving through those accounts is not for art." Ji-ah's hands were around the water glass. She did not drink. "How do you know I flagged them?" "Because the second time you flagged it, someone in the Foundation's compliance office made a call to a number that connects, after 3 transfers, to Lim Sung-woo's chief of staff." She thought about Baek Jae-hyun, that politely blank face, the conversation she wasn't supposed to overhear. "What's the money for?" she said. "Political infrastructure. Vote buying at the legislative level. Not small amounts, not local. National, judicial appointments, Port Authority contracts. The offshore acquisition accounts run through 7 jurisdictions and clean approximately 3 billion won per quarter." He said this without drama, which made it worse. The Lim family has been operating this network for almost 2 decades. Your father's prosecution case 9 years ago, the one that destroyed his career, that case was manufactured to acquire leverage over him. He knew something he shouldn't have known, and rather than kill him, they dismantled him, made him dependent, made your family dependent. The fire made sounds, rain against the window. "That's a large claim," Ji-ah said. Her voice was steady in a way she didn't feel. "Yes." "Do you have evidence?" "I have significant evidence. Federal investigators have pieces of it. The full picture requires what's inside the encrypted authorization archive your Foundation account can access. The secondary archive, not the operational one. The one you've never been given a reason to open." Ji-ah looked at him. "How do you know about the secondary archive?" "Because I spent 14 months mapping the Foundation's digital architecture." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because the Lim network has interests that overlap with mine, and not in ways that are mutually beneficial. So this is about your business. Some of it. What part isn't?" A pause. Just long enough. "Your father." She put the water glass down. "Don't," she said. "Ji-ah, don't use my father." Her voice had an edge she hadn't planned on. "Whatever else this is, don't use him as a Don't make that a reason. Don't dress this up as something it isn't. I'm not dressing it up. His voice stayed level. I'm telling you that the case that destroyed your father was run by a prosecutor named Hwang Sung-pil, who received 400 million won across 18 months from a real estate entity that connects to Lim Dae-jun. The disbarment proceedings, the financial fraud charges, the witness testimonies, all of it was paid for. Your father went to prison for 8 months for something that was put in front of him deliberately. He paused. I've known this for 2 years. I didn't tell you because you didn't know where I was. Because I didn't know how to tell you without it becoming this. He gestured slightly at the space between them, at the problem of them sitting in a room together, at all of it. Ji-ah stood up. She didn't go anywhere. She just needed to be standing. She walked to the window and looked at the rain on the glass, at the dark shapes of trees beyond, at her own reflection. The ruined gown, the makeup disaster, the woman she'd spent the entire night becoming. Why were you in New York? She said it to the window. 3 years ago, the truth. Behind her, silence. Then, monitoring a financial transfer that moved through a gallery you were consulting for. Not me specifically. Not you specifically. At first. Another pause. Then you. She turned. That's a confession. It's an answer. You asked for the truth. You surveilled me. I ran a background check and showed up at a bar where you were having a terrible evening. His voice was flat, but there was something underneath it she couldn't quite reach. I didn't plan anything that happened after that. That's a convenient distinction. It's still true. They looked at each other across the room, the fire, the rain. 3 years and a silence between them that had the specific weight of unfinished things. You let me go, she said. In New York. The FBI came to my apartment and told me who you were, and I disappeared, and you... I knew they'd come to you. You knew. I'd been watching the investigation for months. I knew they were going to approach people in my periphery. I made sure you were... He stopped. I made adjustments. What does that mean? It means you were removed from certain documents before they were seen by certain people. He said it like it cost him something. It means that when you disappeared, no one came looking for you in any way that would have been dangerous. Ji-ah felt the room rearrange itself slightly. You protected me. I made a practical decision. Don't do that. Her voice was sharp. Don't make it smaller than it was to make it easier to say. He looked at her, said nothing. You could have just let me go, she said. Into whatever the investigation would have made of me. You had no obligation. I know I had no obligation. So why? The fire popped. Rain. Min-jae looked at his hands, then back at her. Because I'd been watching a lot of people make calculations about you for a long time. Your father's enemies. Sung-woo's family. Your own management at the foundation. And not one of them, not a single one, had ever made a calculation that included what you actually wanted. He said it simply, not sentimentally, like reading a line from a document. It seemed like the minimum decent thing to do. Ji-ah stood at the window with rain falling behind her reflection and felt something move in her chest that she categorically refused to name. Not now, not here. The door opened. The woman from earlier returned with clothes folded over one arm, dark trousers, a plain gray sweater, socks, and a pair of soft indoor shoes and a small first aid kit. She set everything on the side table, looked at neither of them, and left. Ji-ah changed in the bathroom down the hall. The mirror was honest. She looked like someone who had survived something without fully processing what it was, which was accurate. She cleaned the cut on her heel, which was small and had mostly stopped bleeding, and wrapped it with the bandage from the kit. The sweater smelled like cedar and something neutral, and it fit him perfectly in the way borrowed clothes always did, and it was the most comfortable she'd been in months. When she came back, Min-jae was standing near the window she'd been standing at. He'd taken off the overcoat, dark shirt underneath, sleeves rolled to the elbow. She noticed the scars on his knuckles again, and this time she also noticed the one on his left forearm, longer, older, running parallel to the bone in a way that didn't happen by accident. He turned when she came in. What happens now? She said. Tonight? Nothing. You stay here. It's the safest location available to you in Seoul right now. I'm not committing to anything beyond tonight. I'm not asking you to. And the archive access. I'm not asking you for that either. Not tonight. She looked at him. But eventually, yes, eventually I'm going to need your help. He said it without apology. But I'm not going to pretend that's not true to make you more comfortable with the arrangement. At least there was that. Ji-ah sat back down on the couch. She was exhausted in the deep tissue way, the kind of tired that lived below the level of sleep. Her body had used up adrenaline it hadn't known it was carrying for months. She looked at the fire and tried to think clearly and found that clearly was temporarily unavailable. Tell me about the betrayal inside your organization. She'd been turning over what he'd said in the car, the specific phrasing. Tonight wasn't an accident. He was quiet. You said my showing up wasn't chance. You said things are happening around the foundation. But you also look... She paused, picking at it. When you said it wasn't an accident, you didn't mean someone planned for me to run into you. You meant something else. He sat down. Across from her, elbows on knees, looking at the table. There are people who know my movements, he said slowly. People I've trusted for years. And for the last 4 months, those movements have been reaching the wrong ears too quickly. Small things. Meetings rerouted. Conversations that produced results they shouldn't have. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing I could point to cleanly. But enough to notice. Enough to be certain. And tonight, I was at the Riverside Grand to observe a meeting between Lim Dae-jun's financial director and someone from a rival network. I was there unofficially. Nobody in my organization knew exactly where I was. He paused. 2 of Sungwoo's security team showed up inside the hotel's service corridors 30 minutes before I arrived. They weren't there for the gala. Ji-ah absorbed this. They were there for you. Or to see who I was meeting with. Either way, someone told them. He looked at the table. Someone close. How many people have that kind of access to your schedule? Too many, he said. Which is the problem? The fire was settling. Outside, the rain had shifted. Lighter now, less punishing, the kind that would go on for hours. Ji-ah looked at the man across the table and tried to reconcile the parts of him she'd been carrying for 3 years with the person currently sitting here admitting to being outmaneuvered by someone inside his own organization. She thought she'd know how she'd feel about him if she ever ended up back in the same room. She'd been wrong about that. Sleep, he said. I mean it. Nothing happens tonight. What about... I have people watching the streets around your previous residence, the Foundation's offices. Your parents' house in Mapo. He said it matter-of-factly. Your family is not currently in danger. Sungwoo's priority right now is containment of the scandal, not escalation. You have a window. She didn't ask how he'd already deployed people to her family's address when he'd only met her an hour ago. She understood what that meant about the degree to which this situation had been anticipated. It should have been terrifying. It was partly terrifying. She slept in a room upstairs with a locked door and her hand resting near the lamp on the nightstand, which was the only object in the room she could plausibly use as a weapon, and she slept for 5 hours straight. She dreamed about water. In the morning, the rain had stopped and Seoul's skyline was clean and hard against a white sky. Ji-ah found coffee in the kitchen and stood at the long window that overlooked the rear of the property, which was a courtyard of wet stone and old trees, and drank it in thought. Min-jae's household moved around her with the efficiency of a well-run operation, which was what it was. Nobody spoke to her unnecessarily. Nobody ignored her either. She had the specific status of a person whose presence had been sanctioned by the person at the center of everything, which meant the staff operated around her at a respectful, watchful distance. He came in from outside at 8, coat damp, phone in hand. He looked like he hadn't slept. The Foundation's board met this morning, he said, setting his phone on the counter. Emergency session. Apparently there's an outstanding concern about an employee's unauthorized departure from a Foundation event and the security implications thereof. They're already moving. Faster than expected. He poured coffee and didn't drink it. Baek Jae-hyun requested an emergency access review on your Foundation credentials at 6 this morning. Ji-ah set her cup down. They're locking me out of the archive. They're trying to, But a credential freeze takes 48 hours to propagate through the Foundation's offshore authorization system if it's initiated domestically. The system was built that way deliberately, by someone who had other uses for that delay window. He looked at her. You have approximately 36 hours of active access remaining. And you're telling me this because you're going to have to decide what you want to do with it. You said you weren't asking me for that last night. Last night it wasn't urgent. His voice was level. This morning it is. Ji-ah looked at him, at the tiredness under his eyes that he was not bothering to hide, at the way he stood with his coffee untouched, the way people stood when they were thinking fast and the body had become temporarily irrelevant. You want me to pull the archive, she said. I want you to have what's in it. Whatever you decide to do with it after that is your decision. But you'd need a copy. Yes. For what? To complete what I've been building for 14 months. The full evidentiary map, the account trails, the political payments, the manufactured case against your father. He paused. Without the secondary archive, the map has a gap the size of a city block. With it, it's complete enough to give federal investigators a package they can't ignore and can't be pressured out of. And what do you get from this? He looked at her directly. The people who've been feeding information out of my organization have been doing it in exchange for protection from the Lim network. If the Lim network goes down, my security problem resolves. It's not altruistic. I want you to understand that clearly. She did understand it. What she also understood was that he was the only person who had told her things straight in as long as she could remember. I'll need a secure connection, she said. I have one. And I'm going to need time to go through what I pull before you see any of it. He paused. Then, agreed. I mean it. You don't get to look over my shoulder. Agreed, Desam, he said again, like the word was simpler the second time. Ji-ah picked up her coffee. I want to talk to my father today. Min-jae shook his head slightly. Not by phone, not yet. If Sung-woo's team is monitoring your family, I know how to be careful. Do you? It wasn't hostile, it was a genuine question, which was worse. Ji-ah thought about the years she'd spent believing the structures around her were simply what the world looked like. The engagement, the foundation position, the family arrangements she'd never fully examined. She thought about how carefully it had all been built to look like choices. I'm learning, she said. He almost said something. She saw it in his face, the decision to let the moment pass instead. He picked up his phone and left the kitchen, and Ji-ah stood at the window with her coffee and looked at the wet courtyard and thought about 36 hours and what fit inside them. She was on the secure terminal by 9:30. The secondary archive loaded slowly. It was large, much larger than she'd expected, 7 years of encrypted authorization records with metadata she'd never had reason to look at. She worked methodically, the way she'd been trained to approach archival materials, building an index before pulling individual files, tracing the structure before reading the content. By noon, she'd found enough to understand why Baek Jae-hyun had tried to freeze her access. By 2 in the afternoon, she found her father's name, not in one document, in dozens, as a subject, as a target, as a problem to be managed, named in internal communications between Lim Dae-jun's chief of staff and the prosecutor, Hwang Song-pil, dated 14 months before her father's arrest. Spreadsheets that laid out, with the bloodless efficiency of corporate planning, exactly how a man's life was going to be dismantled, and why, and what it would cost, and who would pay it. Ji-ah sat in front of the screen for a long time without moving. Her father had been a decent man in a profession full of indecent ones, and they had put a grid around him and collapsed it, and he had been too isolated and too proud to understand what was happening until it was already done. She had been 23 years old, she had sat in the courthouse gallery and watched the verdict and not cried until the parking structure, where she'd sat in her car for 2 hours and come out of it with something cold and permanent lodged in her sternum that she had never fully managed to remove. She knew now what it was. It was this exact information, the knowledge that it was done deliberately and could have been proven and wasn't, because the people who could have proven it were being paid to ensure it couldn't be. Min-jae found her at 4. He knocked, which she noted. He stood in the doorway and looked at her face and said nothing for a moment. How much? He said finally. All of it. Her voice was level. She'd had 2 hours with the information, and she'd moved through the shock into something quieter and more resolute. The payments to Huang, the case construction, the witness preparation, the appeal interference. She looked at the screen. The account that funded it connects to 3 other accounts that connect to the political infrastructure you described. It's all here. He came into the room. He looked at the screen without touching anything. She watched his face, and he was doing the same thing she'd done, reading quickly, building the picture. And his expression went very still, in a way she recognized as the stillness that replaced emotion in people who had learned that emotion in their line of work was expensive. "We need to move quickly," he said. "Beck will find a workaround for the freeze timeline. We have maybe 20 hours of safe window left." "I know. I have a federal contact, prosecutor's office, organized crime division. She's clean. I've verified it 6 ways and she's clean. I can get her a secure summary of what you've found." "I want to be part of that conversation." He looked at her. "Not optional," Ji-ah said. "If my name is attached to this archive pull, I am part of whatever happens with it. It's safer if you're not visible in the... My father's life is in these files. His name, his 8 months in a prison cell, his 3 years of legal costs that left my family with nothing." She kept her voice even. "I am not staying in a safe room while someone else decides what to do with his story." Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the afternoon light was changing, the white sky going gray again, as clouds moved in from the coast. "All right," he said. She was already pulling the files she needed when his phone rang. He answered it, listened for 4 seconds, and his entire body changed. "When?" he said. His voice dropped to something she hadn't heard from him yet, flat and cold and operational in a way that had nothing to do with the conversation they'd just been having. He listened again. "How many?" Another pause. He ended the call and turned to look at her with an expression that had rearranged itself completely, and in that rearrangement Ji-ah saw, for the first time, the thing Seoul whispered about, the intelligence behind the eyes that was not kind. The precision of a man thinking through consequences rather than feeling his way toward them. "What?" she said. "Sung-woo made an announcement this morning." His voice was measured. "Charity Gala, 3 days from now. Seoul Museum of Modern Art. He's presenting the Foundation's new cultural endowment." He paused. "And announcing a reconciliation with you." Ji-ah went cold. "He can't announce..." "He's already announced. It went to press 40 minutes ago. Photos from the engagement earlier in the year, statement about shared vision, the full exercise." He put his phone in his pocket. "You're publicly back in the relationship you just fled, which means if you're not visibly present at that gala, the questions it raises become very significant. And if you are present, he controls the narrative. And your access to everything in this archive becomes a liability he'll need to manage." Min-jae looked at her directly. "He's just made you a problem that can't be solved quietly anymore." Ji-ah stared at the screen, at her father's name in a column of financial transfers, at the years of it. "He's forcing my hand," she said. "Yes." "So we have 3 days." "Yes." She looked at Min-jae, and he looked at her, and in the dimming afternoon light of that room, with everything they'd built in the last 18 hours sitting between them, like something that had been waiting a long time to exist, she felt the full weight of what there was no going back from. "Then we need to use them," she said. "All 3. He nodded once. Then he turned toward the door, already thinking ahead. And behind him, Yoon Ji-ah looked at her father's name one more time before she closed the file and began. 3 days was not enough time. Ji-ah understood this on the second morning, sitting across from Min-jae's federal contact in a safe house apartment in Seoul-dae-mun-gu that smelled like old coffee and carpet glue, watching the woman read through the archive summary with the particular focused stillness of someone who had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of document. Her name was Prosecutor Seo Hyun-jung, 41 years old, Organized Crime Division, 12 years in the office, and reportedly the only person in her department who had never taken a meeting with anyone connected to the Lim network. Min-jae had described her as clean. Watching her now, Ji-ah believed it. Not because she seemed incorruptible in any idealized sense, but because she had the specific exhaustion of someone who had been right about things for a long time without being able to prove them. Seo looked up from the documents. "This is the secondary archive," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ji-ah said. "You pulled this yourself, directly from the Foundation's authorization system. Yesterday afternoon, I have roughly 12 hours of active access remaining before the credential freeze propagates." Seo looked at Min-jae, who was standing near the window with his arms crossed and saying nothing, then back at Ji-ah. "Your name is on the pull record. That's unavoidable." "I know. Which means when Baek Jae-hyun sees the access log, he knows exactly what you took. He already suspects. The announcement about the gala, Sung-woo's reconciliation statement, that was a response to me not being controllable anymore. They know I have something. They just don't know how much." Seo put the documents down. She picked up her coffee, found it cold, set it back. "What I can do with this in 3 days is limited. These account trails require forensic verification. The political payment records need authentication against external banking records I'd have to subpoena. A subpoena of this scope goes through the presiding judge assigned to organized crime investigations," Min-jae said from the window. "Who is Judge Park Hyun-soo?" Seo went still. "Who received," Min-jae continued, "4 payments totaling 800 million won across the last 2 years from a property development entity that connects to Lim Dae-jun's holding company in the 4th layer of the archive Ji-ah pulled yesterday." A silence in the room. "I haven't had time to read the 4th layer yet," Seo said carefully. "I know. I'm telling you now so you understand why we can't run this through standard subpoena channels." He moved away from the window. "The gala is in 2 days. Sung-woo is going to use it to consolidate the narrative. Ji-ah, publicly back in the fold, the Foundation's endowment legitimized in front of 200 witnesses, including 3 cabinet-level officials. After that event, the political protection around the Lim network becomes significantly harder to penetrate. The window we have right now is the only window, Seo said. Yes. She looked at the documents. What are you proposing? The gala itself. Live broadcast. The museum streams all its major events for the Cultural Endowment Program. Ji-ah attends as Sung-woo expects. We coordinate a simultaneous release of the archive summary to 3 journalists with the documentation to back it, timed to the moment Sung-woo makes the endowment announcement. While he's standing in front of cameras celebrating, the story breaks around him. Min-jae pulled a chair out and sat. You file emergency injunctive proceedings against the Foundation accounts in the same window. You don't need Judge Park for an emergency filing. You go to the duty judge that night, who is Magistrate Cho, who is not in any of these documents. Seo was quiet for a long time. She looked at Ji-ah. You'd need to be inside that gala. Yes. With Sung-woo believing everything is normal. Yes. And his security team, Baek Jae-hyun, will be there. Ji-ah felt the name land in her chest with the weight it now carried. Yes. That's a significant personal risk. I know what it is. Seo looked at her with the eyes of someone who made professional assessments of human beings for a living. You understand that if anything goes wrong inside that building, nothing goes wrong, Min-jae said. My people will be in the building, not visibly, but placed correctly. Your people cannot be inside a federal operation. They won't be inside your operation. They'll be inside the same building at the same time as a coincidence. Seo's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. You've been running operations in parallel with law enforcement for 14 years. And the conviction rate of prosecutors I've worked adjacent to is significantly above average. That's a remarkable way to put it. It's an accurate one. Ji-ah watched this exchange with the sensation of standing on ground that was solid but recently disturbed, the kind of stability that held as long as you didn't push too hard on any one spot. These two people had history, not personal, but professional. The kind of mutual awareness that developed when a prosecutor and an organized crime figure had been circling each other's perimeters for years without direct collision. I'll file the emergency proceedings, Seo said finally. She began gathering the documents. But I need the full 4th layer of the archive before tomorrow evening. and I need a chain of custody record for the poll that will hold up to a defense challenge. I can provide that, Ji-ah said, and I need you to understand, Seo looked at her directly, that after the gala, after the filing, you are going to be in a deposition room for a very long time. Everything you know about the Foundation's operations, your own role in it, the access codes, the authorizations you processed, the flags you raised and were told to ignore. All of it. Ji-ah nodded. I know. You process those authorizations. Your name is on the records. A defense attorney will... I know what a defense attorney will do. Her voice came out steady. She was surprised by this. I'm not under any illusions about my position. Seo held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, brief and professional, and left. The apartment was quiet. Ji-ah sat with the table between herself and the space where Seo had been and looked at the documents spread in front of her and felt the architecture of what she'd agreed to settle into her bones. Min-jae hadn't moved. You could have told me about Judge Park before this meeting, she said. I didn't know how much you'd read of the fourth layer. You knew exactly how much I'd read. You were watching the screen. A pause. I wanted Seo to hear it from me directly, so she understood the full scope of what we're working around. He said it evenly. It wasn't a manipulation. It was a controlled revelation. Those are different things. Are they? She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them resolved the question. She spent the remainder of the second day preparing. Min-jae's secure analyst, a young woman named Hana, who communicated primarily through typed notes and had the concentrated energy of someone running 4 processes simultaneously, walked Ji-ah through the chain of custody documentation for the archive pull. They built it carefully, every timestamp logged, every access point recorded, the methodology clean enough to withstand the legal challenge Seo had described. Ji-ah called her parents from a secured line at 7 in the evening. Her father answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was the same as it always was, slightly cautious, slightly careful, the voice of a man who had learned that phones could be listened to before most people considered that a realistic possibility. She didn't tell him everything. She told him she was safe, that she was working on something, that he should stay home for the next 72 hours and not answer calls from unknown numbers. He was quiet after she said this. Ji-ah, he said, what have you gotten into? Something that was already there before I got into it? She paused. Appa, there are things I found out about what happened to you, about the case. Silence. It wasn't... Her throat closed for a half second. She pushed through it. It wasn't real. What they charged you with, none of it was real. She heard him breathe, just breathe for a moment, on the other end of the line. I know, he said quietly. You knew. I've known for a long time. His voice was careful in a way that ached. I just didn't know how to say it without... He stopped. I didn't want you carrying it. Ji-ah pressed her fingers against her eyes, thought about the cold thing that had lived in her sternum since the courthouse, about how long he'd been carrying it alone so she wouldn't have to. I'm going to fix it, she said. Ji-ah, I'm going to fix it. I need you to trust me. He was quiet for a long moment. Be careful. I will. I mean it. Whatever you're doing, whoever you're doing it with. Another pause. Be more careful than you think you need to be. She didn't ask how he knew. She already knew how he knew. She slept better the second night than the first. That surprised her. The morning of the gala, Min-jae's household moved differently. Not loudly. Not with the obvious tension of people preparing for something dangerous. But there was a quality to the movement. Faster, slightly compressed. The way time moved inside a system that had calibrated itself to a deadline, that made the air feel different. Ji-ah was in the dining room with coffee and the 4th layer documents when Min-jae came in with 2 of his senior people. She'd met them briefly over the past 2 days. A broad-shouldered man named Oh, who moved with the particular economy of someone with a military background, and a woman named Chaewon, who was 30-something, fine-featured, and had the eyes of someone who processed the room before she entered it. Both of them knew Ji-ah's name. Neither of them had volunteered their opinions about her presence. Min-jae laid a floor plan of the Seoul Museum of Modern Art on the table. The gala starts at 7, he said. Ji-ah needs to arrive by 6:40 with Sung Woo's team. They'll expect her to come in the official party entrance. He traced a route on the floor plan with one finger. The live broadcast starts at 8:15 for the endowment announcement. That's our window. SEO files at 8:10. The journalists receive the package at 8:12. By 8:15, when Sung-woo starts speaking, the first stories are already publishing. Oh was looking at the floor plan. Security staging is going to be here and here, he indicated 2 points near the main hall. If Lim's people have the outer cordon, they do. I confirmed that an hour ago. Then our placement needs to be interior. Oh looked at Chaewon. Something passed between them. Which is tighter? I know. Ji-ah looked at the floor plan. Where do I need to be for the broadcast window? Main hall. As visible as possible. You need to be standing next to Sung-woo when the announcement starts. Min-jae looked at her. I know what I'm asking. You're asking me to stand next to a man I despise in front of cameras while his family's criminal infrastructure collapses in real time around him. She kept her voice level. I understand the requirement. If he gets any indication before 8:15, he won't. She looked at the floor plan. He's going to be managing 100 people. His job tonight is to look like a man who has everything under control. He'll want me compliant and visible and quiet, and that's exactly what I'll give him. Until I don't. Min-jae looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The slight recalibration that happened when she said something that landed differently than he'd anticipated. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. The smallest shift, like a current moving through still water. He looked at Oh. Give us the room. Oh and Chaewon left without question. The door closed. Ji-ah put her coffee down. What? Min-jae was still looking at his phone. Then he set it on the table and looked at her, and she knew before he spoke that whatever was coming was not part of the plan they'd built over the past 2 days. There's a problem, he said. What kind? The federal contact CO used to verify the magistrate assignment for the emergency filing. He stopped, picked the thought back up. She used an internal channel to confirm that Magistrate Cho was the duty judge tonight. That channel is logged. Ji-ah didn't understand yet. Logged by who? By the same oversight system that routes Organized Crime Division communications for review. He looked at her steadily. Review that goes to the supervising senior prosecutor of the division. Who is? A pause that lasted exactly 1 second. Hwang Sung-pil, he said. The room went very quiet. Ji-ah heard the name the way you heard things at high altitude, slightly delayed, the sound arriving after the impact. Hwang Sung-pil, the prosecutor who had built the case against her father, whose name appeared in 14 months of advanced communications in the archive, who had received 400 million won to dismantle a man who had done nothing except know too much, who had apparently, at some point in the past 9 years, been appointed supervising senior prosecutor of the Organized Crime Division. He's Seo's supervisor, Ji-ah said. Yes. He's been her supervisor. For 3 years. Does she know, She knows he's her supervisor. She doesn't know he's in the archive. I didn't show her the specific payment records because I was building toward that conversation after the filing. I thought we had time to sequence it correctly. His voice had the quality of a man examining his own mistake without flinching. I was wrong about that. So when Seo used the internal channel, Hwang saw the communication. He knows Seo is planning an emergency filing tonight. He doesn't know the full scope yet. The channel communication was limited, but he knows enough to make a call. Ji-ah stood up. She needed to be standing. What call? 10 minutes ago, Baek Jae-hyun received a message from an encrypted number. Min-jae turned his phone to show her. A screenshot. The intercept was clean. The text was 3 words. She has everything. Ji-ah looked at those 3 words and felt the last 48 hours rearrange themselves around a new geometry. Hwang told Baek, she said. Yes. He told Sung-woo's security chief that I have the archive, that I've already pulled it, that there's a filing being prepared. Yes. Which means tonight, she stopped.
rebuilt the thought. Tonight isn't a gala anymore. Min-jae was quiet. They're not going to let me walk out of that building, she said. Not as a question. No. The floor plan was still spread on the table between them. The museum corridors, the main hall, the security staging points. Ji-ah looked at it, and what had been a plan 20 minutes ago now looked like something else entirely. A space that people who wanted her to disappear were going to occupy in large numbers. We abort, she said. We find another way. There isn't another way. Not in this time frame. His voice was careful but direct. The access window closes tonight. After that, the archive is frozen. The political protection around the gala announcement consolidates. SEO will be placed under administrative review by Hwang before she can file anything. He paused. Everything we built over the last 2 days has a 48-hour shelf life. This is the last 48 hours. You're telling me we still go. I'm telling you what the situation is. That's the same thing. No, it isn't. He looked at her directly. I'm not going to tell you to walk into a building where Baek Jae-hyun now knows exactly what you're carrying. That's your decision. Ji-ah looked at him, at the absolute steadiness of his face, at the man who had, by his own admission, spent months mapping the situation and had still been outmaneuvered by a chain of events he didn't see coming, who was looking at her now without asking her to do something he couldn't guarantee would be safe. What changed in your security assessment, she said. For tonight, now that Baek knows. The risk profile elevated substantially. By how much? A pause. Enough that I'm going. She blinked. What? I've been running this from behind the operation, feeding intelligence to CO, coordinating placement, keeping my profile off the event. He picked up the floor plan and looked at it. That's no longer viable. If Baek is in that building with specific knowledge about what we're attempting, I need to be in the room. If you walk into that gala, Sungwoo's entire security apparatus goes to high alert. Your presence will tell Sungwoo that the stakes are higher than he already knows they are, yes. He folded the floor plan. He'll know it's not just his fiancé with documents. He'll know the entire network is in play. That might make him more dangerous. Or it might make him make a mistake. Ji-ah looked at him. You want him to react. You want him off script. I want him focused on me instead of you. He said it plainly. While you complete the broadcast window. The morning light in the dining room was flat and gray. Somewhere outside, Seoul was going about its business with the complete indifference of a city that did not know or care that the people inside this house were about to walk towards something that had become significantly more dangerous than it had been an hour ago. Ji-ah picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. There's something else, she said. It had been sitting in the back of her mind since he'd shown her the intercept, assembling itself into a shape she didn't want to look at directly. Hwang Sung-pil has been supervising the organized crime division for 3 years. In those 3 years, how many investigations into the Lim network came out of that division? Min-jae looked at her. None, she said. Not a question. How many investigations into your organization? Silence. 7, he said. 7 investigations in 3 years. Ji-ah set the cold coffee down. While Hwang was supervising, while the prosecutor who helped destroy my father was sitting at the top of the division tasked with investigating organized crime in Seoul. She looked at him steadily. That's not a coincidence. That's architecture. The same kind of architecture they built around my father. They put the right person in the right office, and then they used that office. Yes. So Seo has been working inside a division that was designed to contain her. Yes. And she doesn't know that. Not fully. She knows Hwang makes things difficult. She doesn't know the specific financial connections. He paused. She will, after tonight. If there is an after tonight, he held her gaze. There will be. Ji-ah looked at the table, at the document she'd spent 2 days building, the archive records and chain of custody files and the spreadsheet of her father's manufactured ruin. She thought about what it had taken to produce these documents,
and what it would mean if they sat in a folder on a secure drive while the window closed and the gala consolidated and Hwang Sung-pil quietly buried whatever Seo had started before it reached daylight. She thought about her father's voice on the phone. I know, I've known for a long time. We need to tell Seo about Hwang, Ji-ah said, before tonight. She goes into that filing knowing her supervisor has been compromised. She finds a way around him, files directly through emergency judicial channels, bypasses Hwang's oversight entirely. If she does that and it fails, her career's finished. Her career is already in danger if Hwang reviews her communication log and understands what she's planning. Ji-ah met his eyes. Tell her. Give her the payment records. Let her make the decision herself. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. He called Seo. Ji-ah listened to one side of the conversation from across the room. Min-jae's voice, measured and direct, laying out the Hwang connection with the same lack of drama he brought to everything. She watched his face while he spoke and listened and spoke again. Seo was not quiet on the other end. She could hear the cadence of someone absorbing information that was reshaping something fundamental about the last 3 years of their working life. He ended the call. She'll file through judicial emergency channels, directly to the duty court, bypassing organized crime division oversight entirely. She says, he paused. She says she's been waiting for a reason to do this for 2 years. Ji-ah exhaled. Good. She also said, a slight pause. She said the evidence trail is strong enough to protect you, in the deposition. She wanted you to hear that. Ji-ah absorbed this. Okay. It doesn't make tonight simple. Nothing about tonight is simple. No. He looked at her. Do you still want to do this? She thought about every room she'd walked into in the last 10 years where someone else had made a decision about what her life was supposed to look like. The engagement she'd accepted to help her family, the foundation position she'd kept her head down in, the flags she'd raised and been told to ignore, the night she'd run barefoot through rain because her body decided before her mind did that it was finished being manageable. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment with something that was quieter than everything else he'd looked at her with over the past 2 days, something that had less strategy in it. Then we have 6 hours, he said. We use them. They did. Ji-ah spent 2 of those hours with Hana going over contingencies, alternative communication channels, backup documentation routing, a dead drop protocol for the archive files that would activate automatically if Ji-ah's phone went offline inside the museum. She spent 1 hour in front of a mirror in the room she'd been given, putting herself back together into the woman who had attended 7 Lim Foundation galas in 4 years. Hair, makeup, the dark green gown Min-jae's household had sourced with startling efficiency, heels she'd actually chosen this time. The transformation was precise and unsettling, and when she looked at her reflection, she recognized the woman looking back but didn't particularly like her, which felt correct. She came downstairs at 5:30 to find Min-jae in the entry hall in a dark suit that fit the way expensive things fit, when expense is not the point. He looked at her. She looked at him. You look like someone who has no concerns, he said. I look like Yoon Ji-ah, senior preservation consultant and dutiful fiancé. Same thing. He held the door. The car's ready. Ji-ah walked past him into the evening. Seoul was lit and moving and indifferent and beautiful in the particular way of cities that have been built on top of many previous versions of themselves, layer on layer, each one convinced it was the permanent arrangement. She got into the car. Min-jae got in beside her, and in a building 2 kilometers north, in the Security Operations Center of the Seoul Museum of Modern Art, a man named Baek Jae-hyun looked at a photograph on his phone, Ji-ah's face, Min-jae's profile, the 2 of them moving toward a black sedan outside a gate that his surveillance team had just identified. And he made a call. On the other end, the voice that answered said 4 words. Change the security configuration. Beck looked at the photograph, at the 2 people in it who had just confirmed by appearing together the full scope of what tonight actually was. How much change? Beck said. All of it, the voice said, and bring the other team in. Beck ended the call. He looked at the museum floor plan on the desk in front of him. the same floor plan Ji-ah had studied that morning, the same corridors and staging points and main hall, and he began making marks on it. Different marks than the ones Min-jae had made. Marks that turned the route into a... The car stopped 2 blocks from the museum, not because it was supposed to, because the traffic had seized up in the particular way that happened when multiple large vehicles were staging in a coordinated pattern, and Oh, who was driving, said one word, problem, and Min-jae was already leaning forward to look through the windshield at the street ahead. 3 police vehicles were parked at 45-degree angles across the main approach to the Seoul Museum of Modern Art, not the casual presence of event security coordination. Staged, deliberate, the kind of positioning that was less about crowd management and more about controlling who got in and who didn't. Beck moved fast, Ji-ah said. He had 6 hours. Min-jae's voice was flat. He was scanning the street with the particular quality of attention that processed information and generated response simultaneously, no gap between receiving and deciding. The police presence is cosmetic. It's there to slow legitimate entry and give his interior team more time to stage. He looked at O. East Service entrance. O was already turning. Ji-ah gripped the door handle as the sedan reversed and took a side street. Her heart was doing something architectural. Not racing exactly, but changing structure. The way a building changed when load-bearing walls started taking weight they hadn't been designed for. She breathed through her nose, counted the breath, let it out. The broadcast window is still 8:15, she said. Yes. If we're delayed getting in. We won't be. He was looking at his phone. A message from Chaewon. Interior position confirmed. 3 of Baek's secondary team near North Stairwell. 2 more by the service corridor to the main hall. He showed Ji-ah the screen. She read it and felt the number land. 5. Just in those 2 positions. Plus Baek himself. Plus whatever Sungwoo's primary detail looked like on a night when their principal already knew the event was compromised. How many of your people inside? She said. 7. Against how many of his? Unknown. 14 minimum. He pocketed the phone. But his people are there to contain, not to confront publicly. We're in a museum full of cameras and cabinet ministers and press. They can't do what they do in a parking garage. Not until they have a reason to. So we don't give them a reason. He looked at her. Until we do. The East Service entrance was a steel door off a loading bay that the museum used for large installation deliveries. Chaewon was standing beside it in a plain dark jacket when the sedan pulled up, looking like someone waiting for a freight delivery, which was exactly what she was supposed to look like. She held the door. They went in. The service corridor smelled like concrete and industrial cleaning products. Fluorescent lights overhead, the distant layered sound of 200 people settling into a gala 1 level up, heels on marble, glassware, the underwater murmur of a string quartet. Ji-ah felt the sound vibrate in her sternum. She had been inside enough of these events to know exactly what the acoustics meant about where people were positioned and how the room was oriented. Museum galas had a specific geometry. She knew this one. Sungwoo is already in the main hall, Chaewon said, moving ahead of them. Arrived at 6:55. His father is present. Lim Dae-jun came in person, which isn't standard. She glanced back. The endowment announcement has been moved up. 8 o'clock, not 8:15. Ji-ah and Min-jae both stopped moving. Why? Min-jae said. Unknown. The event coordinator just sent a revised schedule to the press pool 20 minutes ago. Chaewon's voice was careful. 15-minute compression? 15 minutes. The filing was calibrated to 8:10. The journalist package to 8:12. A 15-minute compression meant Sungwoo spoke before any of it was in motion. Ji-ah looked at Min-jae. Seo, he said. He was already calling. Seo answered on the first ring. He told her. There was a pause on her end that lasted 2 seconds, which was 2 seconds of someone recalculating under pressure, and then she said, I file at 7:55. That's as fast as I can move the documents through the duty clerk. The journalists need the package first. 7:50. I'll send you confirmation. He ended the call. 25 minutes. They had 25 minutes from this corridor to Ji-ah being visible in the main hall while the broadcast window opened around her.
I need to go in, Ji-ah said. I know. Sung-woo needs to see me before the announcement or he'll know something is wrong. I know. That means now. He looked at her. In the fluorescent harshness of the service corridor with the gala sounds drifting down from above, the sweet and the composed expression and the dark eyes that had been calculating since the moment the car stopped, he looked like what he was. Not a man who was afraid. A man who had learned to use the space where fear was supposed to live. Chaewon walks you to the main hall entrance, he said. You enter alone. You find Sung-woo. You stay visible. 45 minutes. And you. I'll come in at 8, main entrance. By then Beck will know I'm in the building and his attention shifts.
That puts you directly in front of his primary team.
Yes.
Min-jae. It splits his focus. His voice didn't change. Which is the point. He can't watch both of us from one position. Ji-ah looked at him and understood, not for the first time and not comfortably, that this man had spent 2 decades making calculations about which risks to absorb personally and which to distribute, and that the calculation he'd just made was not abstract. It was himself, placed in a position of elevated danger because it was the arrangement that gave her the best chance of completing what they'd come here to do. She wanted to say something, couldn't locate the right words in the 20 seconds they had. "Don't get shot," she said. Something moved in his face. Almost. "That's the plan." Chaewon touched Ji-ah's arm. "We need to move." They moved. The stairwell from the service corridor to the main level was utilitarian, bare walls, emergency lighting strips, sound intensifying as they climbed. Ji-ah focused on her breathing and her posture. The muscle memory of 4 years of foundation events was still there, reliable as scar tissue. Back straight, movement deliberate, expression arranged into the specific register of composed professional attendance that she had worn to dozens of rooms exactly like the one she was about to enter. She was Yoon Ji-ah, senior preservation consultant and dutiful fiancé. For 25 more minutes. Chaewon stopped at the door to the main level. "I'll be at the North Corridor Junction. If you need exit." "I won't need exit." Ji-ah put her hand on the door. "I need completion." She pushed through. The main hall of the Seoul Museum of Modern Art was high-ceilinged and deliberately grand, the kind of space designed to make humans feel appropriately scaled against history and culture. Tonight it held approximately 200 people in the soft collision of formal wear and champagne and the specific social performance of Seoul's elite at their most carefully curated. Live broadcast cameras were set up along the east wall, their operators in position, red lights not yet active. The string quartet had given way to recorded ambient music. The energy in the room had the compressed quality of an event approaching its formal moment. Ji-ah saw Sung-woo across the room in 4 seconds. He was standing near the central installation, a contemporary sculpture, steel and glass, around which the foundation had organized the room's focal point. In a group of 4 men she recognized as board members, and one she didn't. His posture was perfect. His expression was perfectly calibrated, confident, gracious, a man presiding over an event that was going exactly as planned. He had always been good at this. She had always known that, and never let herself examine what that competence was actually in service of. He saw her at almost the same moment. The calculation happened behind his eyes in the span of a blink. She watched it. The arrival of relief, "She's here," immediately followed by the assessment, the reading of her face and posture for information, the determination of threat level. She kept her expression neutral and walked toward him with the particular gait of a woman who had decided to show up to an event she had every reason to avoid and was choosing to behave as though nothing was wrong. The group around him shifted slightly as she approached. Sang-woo stepped forward, away from the board members, and met her halfway. He took her hand. His grip was firm and slightly too tight. "You came," he said. Low, private, champagne and cold control. "Of course." She let him hold her hand, didn't squeeze back. He looked at her face with that particular focused attention of a man searching for a tell. "We'll talk after," he said. Still quiet, still smooth. "Tonight goes normally, and we talk after." "Naturally." Ji-ah. His grip tightened fractionally. I mean it. So do I. She looked at him with the clearest, calmest eyes she could produce. Tonight goes normally. Something in his face settled. Not trust. She didn't think he was capable of trust in any direction that wasn't instrumental, but a provisional decision to accept the surface of what she was presenting. He released her hand. He turned back to his board members and drew her into the circle with a practiced gesture of inclusion. And Ji-ah stood beside Lim Sung-woo and smiled at men whose names were in her father's files and held a glass of champagne she didn't drink and counted minutes. 16 minutes. 14. 11. At 7:52, her phone vibrated once against her palm where she held it at her side. CO. Filed. Confirmation number transmitted. Judge Cho's clerk received. 8 minutes early. Something in Ji-ah's chest unlocked a single degree. At 7:54, a second vibration. The journalist contact, package received, verifying, 8-minute hold before publication. Ji-ah was mid-sentence, responding to a board member's question about the foundation's Venice acquisition when she felt the second message and absorbed it without changing her expression. 8 minutes. The announcement was 6 minutes away. The first stories would publish 2 minutes after Sung-woo started speaking. She breathed. She became aware of Baek Jae-hyun at 7:56. He appeared at the periphery of the room from the north corridor. Plain dark suit, no earpiece visible, but she knew it was there, small and flesh-toned behind his ear. He moved along the wall with the economy of a man who understood sightlines, and his eyes found her across the room with a directness that had nothing social in it. He knew. He had known since the photograph his surveillance team sent him. He was here not as security for an event, but as a person with a specific task. Ji-ah looked away from him, back to the board member. Continued her sentence. 6 minutes. At 7:58, the room changed. It was subtle, the way rooms changed when someone entered who altered the balance of attention. Ji-ah felt it in the shift of bodies near the main entrance, a slight collective reorientation, the way iron filings move toward a magnet. She didn't look immediately. She finished the sentence she was in, excused herself from the board member's orbit with a touch on the arm and a manufactured smile, and then she turned. Kang Min-jae stood at the entrance to the Seoul Museum of Modern Art's main hall in a dark suit with the particular quality of presence that Seoul had spent 14 years whispering about, and every person in the room who knew who he was, and in this room, that was most of them, underwent the specific internal rearrangement of people who had prepared for an elegant evening and suddenly found themselves inside something else entirely. Sung-woo went still across the room. Lim Dae-jun, Sung-woo's father, who had been speaking to 2 cabinet officials near the broadcast setup, turned. Ji-ah saw his face from 20 meters and watched 60 years of controlled power strip back to something rawer and more reptilian underneath. Baek Jae-hyun's hand moved to his jacket. Min-jae walked into the room like he owned the floor beneath his feet and everything that had ever been built on it, and his eyes found Ji-ah across 200 people, and something passed between them in that fraction of a second that wasn't a signal or a plan or a strategy, just acknowledgement, just, I see you, I'm here. Then everything happened at once. Baek moved away from the wall. One of his secondary team materialized from the east side corridor. A third appeared near the main entrance behind Min-jae, cutting off the exit. The room read the movement, felt the geometry of it, and the social noise began to thin, conversations faltering, the particular human instinct that recognized the difference between event staff moving and people moving with intent. Min-jae didn't stop walking. He moved directly toward the center of the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who had decided that stopping was not an available option. An O materialized from somewhere near the west wall, and 2 more of Min-jae's people stepped into positions that weren't aggressive but were precise. And Ji-ah understood that the room was now divided into competing geometries, and the broadcast cameras along the east wall were already running because camera operators, whatever else they were, turned on their equipment when the room told them to. The red lights were on. Live. Ji-ah looked at her phone. 7:59. 1 minute. Sung-woo broke from his position near the sculpture. He crossed toward her with the focused movement of a man who had run out of patience for the social performance and was now in operational mode, and his face had the look she'd seen once before, in a penthouse suite above another woman's shoulder, of pure calculation without the courtesy of concealment. "You brought him here." Low, cutting. He stopped 2 feet from her. "You actually brought him here." "I came alone," Ji-ah said. "Don't." His jaw was tight. "Don't do that. Whatever you think you're doing, I came to the gala. You announced it publicly. What was I supposed to do?" "You know exactly what this is," his voice dropped further. "You have one chance. Give me the archive files, right now. Whatever you pulled, whatever he helped you build, you give it to me and we walk out of this, and tomorrow, none of tonight happened." Ji-ah looked at him, at the face she had spent 8 months preparing herself to spend a life beside, at the architecture of the man underneath the performance. The precision, the instrumentalism, the complete and structural absence of anything he couldn't use. "No," she said. His eyes went cold. "Ji-ah." "No." She held his gaze. "It's already filed. It's already with the press. In about 40 seconds, your father's name is going to be in a story that's going to the front page of every major outlet in Seoul, and there's nothing you can do about it in this room in the next 40 seconds that changes that." She watched him process this, watched the calculation compress and accelerate behind his eyes, watched the moment he reached the part of the calculation that was no longer about the archive. He reached for her arm. He didn't reach it, because the room exploded, not metaphorically, not the polite social implosion of a scandal breaking in real time. The North Corridor service door blew open with the specific sound of a door being taken off its frame, and 3 men in tactical gear came through it, and Ji-ah had exactly the time it took to understand that these were not Min-jae's people and not Baek's security team, and not anything related to the police vehicles staged outside before the shooting started. Not into the crowd, not initially. The first 2 shots were suppressed. She heard them as pressure and a thud rather than a crack, and a vase on the installation pedestal 20 feet away exploded into fragments. And then the room understood what was happening, and 200 people became the kind of chaos that expensive venues were not designed to contain. Glass, screaming. The string quartet's corner overturning as people moved. The broadcast cameras. The operators had dropped behind their equipment, 2 of them, but 1 was still running, the red light still on. And somewhere in Ji-ah's mind, the fact of that registered as the only thing that mattered. Sung-woo's hand closed on her arm. She drove her elbow back into his sternum, sharp and deliberate, the way she'd been shown in a self-defense class 4 years ago that she'd attended twice and apparently retained. He exhaled hard, and his grip broke, and she moved. Toward the east wall. Toward the cameras. Toward the 1 red light that was still on. She heard Min-jae's voice cut through the chaos from somewhere to her left. Not shouting, not panicked, the voice of a man issuing orders that expected to be followed. And she heard Oh's voice responding, and she heard the specific sound of people who were trained for this kind of situation moving differently than the 200 people who weren't. Something hit her shoulder from the side. A person running, civilian, blind with panic, catching her at full speed and spinning her into the edge of a display case. The corner of the case hit her hip, and she grabbed the wall and stayed upright and kept moving. The camera. The red light. 15 feet. The 3 men from the North Corridor were moving through the room with the specific efficiency of people who had a target, and Ji-ah understood with a cold clarity that settled over the panic like ice water that the target was not random. They had a list. They were moving toward positions, not chaos. Someone had sent them here with names. 10 feet from the camera. A hand closed on her shoulder from behind. Not Sung-woo, different grip, harder, professional. And she was yanked backward and spun and found herself looking at one of Baek's secondary team, a man she didn't know. And his expression was the blank operational expression of someone who had been given instructions about what to do if this specific situation arose. "Don't," she said. He didn't care what she said. She heard the shot before she understood what it meant, not suppressed this time. Full report, shockingly loud in the high-ceilinged hall, and the man holding her shoulder flinched and looked behind him, and his grip loosened, and Ji-ah pulled free and did not look back because looking back was not going to help her reach the camera. 5 feet. She reached the camera operator. She, young, crouched behind his equipment, headset still on, eyes wide. She grabbed the side of the camera housing and looked directly into the lens and said, in a voice she was surprised to find steady, "My name is Yoon Ji-ah. I'm a senior consultant at the Lim Foundation for Cultural Heritage. Tonight, prosecutor Seo Hyun-jung of the Seoul Organized Crime Division filed emergency injunctive proceedings against the Foundation's offshore accounts. I am providing testimony in support of those proceedings." Her phone was in her hand. She held the screen up to the camera. The confirmation number from Seo's message, the timestamp, visible for 3 seconds. The documentary evidence is already in the hands of the press. This testimony is being recorded. Whatever happens in this room tonight, another shot from somewhere in the room, closer. She didn't flinch. The record exists. The red light stayed on. Behind her, the room was still moving, still loud, still broken glass and overturned furniture and 200 people trying to become smaller than they were. She turned from the camera. Min-jae was 20 feet away. He had taken his jacket off. His shirt was dark on the left side below his ribs, and she understood what dark meant on a white shirt, and the cold clarity shifted into something with edges that cut. He was standing in the center of the hall with 2 of his people flanking him, facing the north corridor where one of the tactical team remained, and his face had the expression she'd seen him building towards since the first night in the alley. Not anger, not fear, not any version of either. The expression of a man who had reduced the situation to its essential geometry and was operating entirely within that geometry without remainder. Baek Jae-hyun was 10 feet from Min-jae, weapon drawn, and the specific configuration of the 2 men facing each other in the wreckage of the gala had the quality of something that had been a long time arriving. "It's done, Baek," Min-jae said. His voice carried across the hall with perfect quiet. "The filing is in. The broadcast is running." He didn't look at his own side. "This is the part where you make a decision." Baek's weapon didn't waver. "You're bleeding." "I know. The decision is already made." "Is it?" Min-jae looked at him steadily. "You've been working for the Lim family for 11 years. Your loyalty has been consistent and well compensated. But Lim Dae-jun is going to be in a deposition room within 72 hours. His son is going to spend the next decade in legal proceedings. The network that paid your salary is going to be dismantled by the woman standing next to that camera." He paused. "Who are you loyal to when there's nothing left to be loyal to?" Baek's jaw worked. His weapon was level. Ji-ah, from her position near the camera, could see his trigger hand and what his trigger hand was doing. "Baek," Min-jae said. "Don't." The shot came from the East Service corridor. Not from Baek, from behind him, from the direction of the service access where Chae-won had been positioned, and Baek moved forward a half step, and his weapon came down, and he looked at his right hand with an expression of almost scientific attention, and Ji-ah realized the shot had hit his weapon hand, not him, and Chae-won was visible now in the corridor doorway with her arms still extended. Baek's weapon hit the marble floor. He looked at Min-jae. "Get down," Min-jae said, simply, like a direction. Baek got down. The last of the tactical team from the north corridor was contained by Oh and one other in the northwest corner. She could hear it without seeing it, the specific sounds of a confrontation that was ending rather than ongoing. The room was thinning as people found exits, as the panic dispersed into the corridors and stairwells. The broadcast camera's red light was still on, and Ji-ah looked at it, and then looked at Min-jae, and he was walking toward her, and the left side of his shirt was very dark now, darker than it had been, and his pace was even and deliberate, and she understood he was making it even and deliberate because the alternative was not acceptable to him right now. She crossed the distance between them. Up close, the blood was worse. She put her hand against his side instinctively and felt the warmth of it through the shirt, and he looked down at her hand and then at her face. "The camera is still running," she said. "I know." He looked past her at the lens, the red light, the operator who had stayed at his post with a steadiness that Ji-ah would think about for years. "Is it enough?" "Yes." She kept her hand against his side. "It's enough." He exhaled. Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, more like the specific release of pressure that happened when a load-bearing system stopped being tested. He put his hand over hers briefly. Just the weight of it. Then his legs went. Not completely. Not a collapse. Just a degree of failure, the knees bending slightly. The body offering an honest report on what it had been running on for the past hour, and Ji-ah took his weight and braced and said his name sharply, and Oh was there in 3 seconds from somewhere to her left, and the two of them got Min-jae to the floor. Not a fall, controlled, deliberate. And Ji-ah put both hands on his side and looked at Oh and said, "Call." "Already called," Oh said. 30 seconds. Min-jae looked up at the ceiling of the Seoul Museum of Modern Art. The high vaulted plaster, the art historical weight of it, the cameras and the broadcast lights and all the remaining evidence of the evening it had been designed to contain. And Ji-ah knelt beside him with her hands pressed against the wound, and the marble floor was cold under her knees, and the room smelled like cordite and broken glass and spilled champagne and the particular metallic thing that she refused to name. "You said don't get shot," he said. His voice was slightly thinner than it had been. "I said that to you." "I know." The corner of his mouth. "Almost." "I was listening." "Poorly." He looked at her. The dark eyes, the same ones from the alley in the rain, from 6 months in New York, from every version of the specific complicated problem they had been to each other across years and distances and poor decisions. Ji-ah, her name in his mouth, quiet, with the particular weight it had carried since the first time he'd used it, and she hadn't known it yet. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't say anything that sounds like a last thing." He was quiet for a moment. "All right." "Good." Somewhere in the building, sirens were arriving. Real ones, not staged. The kind that came when 300 phone calls hit the emergency system simultaneously. The kind that meant whatever was going to happen next was going to be determined by people and institutions and forces that were larger than any of the decisions made in this room tonight. And Ji-ah knelt on the cold marble floor and kept her hands pressed hard against. The paramedics came in fast and loud, and Ji-ah didn't move her hands until one of them physically displaced them, replacing her pressure with gauze and gloved efficiency. And she sat back on her heels and looked at her palms, and the blood on them was cooling already in the way that blood did when it left a body and met open air. Min-jae was conscious. That was the fact she kept returning to while the paramedics worked around her, and Oh stood over all of them with the focused attention of a man who had decided that nothing else was going to go wrong tonight by sheer force of will. Min-jae was conscious, and his eyes were open, and when they put the oxygen mask on him, he looked at it with mild irritation before accepting it, which felt like information about his condition that she trusted more than anything the paramedic said. "Sir, we need you to stay still." He stayed still. Ji-ah stood up. Her knees ached from the marble. Her hip where she'd hit the display case was going to be a bruise by morning. She could feel it developing already, a deep, specific tenderness that would get worse before it got better. She looked at her hands again and then looked around the room. The Seoul Museum of Modern Art's main hall looked like what it was, a space where something had gone violently wrong inside an occasion designed to make violence feel impossible. Overturned furniture, broken glass, a champagne flute lying on its side near the sculpture installation with a small pool of pale liquid spreading across the marble. The broadcast cameras were still running. She confirmed this. The red lights on 2 of the 3 units still active, the operators back at their stations with the professional tunnel vision of people who understood their job was the record rather than the event. Several dozen guests remained, those who hadn't fled or been evacuated, standing in clusters with the specific shell-shocked stillness of people who had not expected their evening to include this. Lim Dae-jun was against the south wall with 2 uniformed officers standing close enough to make the geometry of his situation clear. He was 71 years old, and he stood with his hands at his sides, and his face had the controlled expression of a man who had weathered crises before, which he had, and who believed this one would resolve the same way the others had, which it would not. Ji-ah looked at him across the room and felt nothing complicated about him. Just the specific cold clarity of someone who had read the documents and understood the decades of deliberate destruction behind that composed face. Sung-woo was not in the room. She became aware of this the way you became aware of a sound that had stopped, the negative space of him. She looked at Oh. West stairwell, Oh said without being asked. 2 minutes after the shooting started, Chaewon is on him. He's trying to leave the building. He's not going to leave the building. Ji-ah nodded. She looked at Min-jae, who was being transferred to a stretcher with the efficient impersonality of emergency medicine. And he turned his head and found her across the room with those dark eyes, and she held the look for 2 seconds and then turned away, because there were things that needed to be done before she was allowed to feel what she was feeling. Her phone had survived the evening intact. Seo answered immediately. I saw the broadcast, Seo said. Her voice was tight and controlled and professional, and underneath all of that, something that sounded like a woman who had been waiting a very long time to make a specific phone call. The filing is confirmed. Magistrate Cho issued the emergency injunction 14 minutes ago. Foundation accounts are frozen, pending investigation. Sung-woo is attempting to exit the museum. Police units are at every exit. He's not going anywhere. A pause. Ji-ah. The testimony you gave on camera, directly to the broadcast, that's going to be the centerpiece of the public record. You understand what that means for you? Yes. It means the deposition is going to be very long. I know. And the defense teams are going to come at your credibility from every... Seo. Ji-ah's voice came out quieter than she intended, but with a weight in it that stopped the sentence. I know what comes next. I've known since I pulled the archive. She looked at the hall around her, at the remnants of the Lim Foundation's last public event, at her father's name existing somewhere in the legal record now, attached to a case that would finally say what it should have said 9 years ago. I'm ready for it. A pause. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Ji-ah put her phone in her pocket. She found Sung-woo in the west stairwell. He was on the second landing, Chaewon standing 8 feet below him on the stairs, with her arms at her sides in the quiet stillness of someone who didn't need to brandish anything to make their presence meaningful. 2 police officers were visible on the landing above. They'd come down from the roof exit and closed the top of the stairwell. Sung-woo was standing between these 2 positions with his jacket still perfectly tailored and his expression doing the extraordinary work of maintaining composure under circumstances that had comprehensively destroyed the structure that composure was built on. He looked at Ji-ah when she appeared at the bottom of the stairs. Something moved through his face. Not regret. She didn't think he was capable of regret in the direction of other people. More like the particular recalculation of a man who had run out of moves and was trying to determine if that was actually true or if there was still an angle. There's no angle, she said. She hadn't meant to say it aloud, but it came out anyway, and it was accurate, so she let it stand. His jaw tightened. You don't know what you've done. I have a reasonable idea. The people you've exposed, the network you've disrupted, you think federal prosecutors can actually protect you from all of that. You think one filing, one broadcast. The broadcast has been running for 40 minutes, Ji-ah said. The stories published 18 minutes ago. They're in 11 countries right now because 3 of the offshore accounts the Foundation ran were registered in jurisdictions with mutual legal assistance treaties with the EU, which means there are prosecutors in 4 European cities who already have this on their desks. She looked at him steadily. It's not one filing. It's the beginning of every filing. You can't contain it from a stairwell. His composure cracked. Not dramatically. It was subtle, the way expensive things failed, a hairline fracture rather than a shattering. But she saw it. My father built everything we had, everything your family needed. The position you held, the access you had, the salary that kept your father from... Don't. Her voice went cold. Don't say his name. From losing everything else after the case. We protected your family. You manufactured the case that destroyed him. The cold in her voice was a different kind than his. His was cultivated, performative, a tool. Hers was the temperature of something real that had been living in her chest for 9 years. You paid Hwang Sung-pil to build it. You used my father's knowledge of your network as a reason to dismantle him before he could use it. And then you positioned my family to be dependent on yours so you had leverage over me in perpetuity. She took a breath. I know all of it. It's all in the archive. It's all in Seo's filing. It's all on the broadcast that has been running for 40 minutes. She paused. There is nothing left to negotiate. Sung-woo looked at her. In the stairwell light, he looked younger than he had in the main hall, not in a way that produced sympathy, just in the way that stripped circumstances had of revealing the actual dimensions of a person. Without the room and the event and the social machinery, he was a man in his mid-30s on a staircase landing, and the size of him without all the structure was less than she'd spent 8 months believing it was. "What do you want?" he said. Flat now, the performance finally gone. "Nothing from you," she said. That's the answer to that question. She turned and went back down the stairs and left him to the officers above and Chaewon below. Her legs were shaking slightly by the time she reached the main hall again. She found a chair that had stayed upright near the east wall and sat in it and looked at her hands again and made herself breathe all the way in and all the way out, the full cycle, until the shaking stopped. Seo arrived in 19 minutes. She came in through the main entrance with 2 investigators and a uniformed officer and moved through the room with the focused efficiency of someone who had transitioned from filing to field without stopping. She crossed to Ji-ah directly. She looked at Ji-ah's hands, the blood dried now in the creases of her knuckles and palms. "Are you injured?" "No, it's not mine." Seo absorbed this. "Min-jae. He's en route to Yonsei. The wound is serious, but..." Ji-ah stopped. She didn't know how serious. She'd been told serious and had been operating on the assumption that serious was not fatal, because the alternative was not something she could hold in her mind right now and still function. "He's being treated." "Okay." Seo sat down in the adjacent chair. For one moment, before the professional machinery engaged again, she looked like what she was, a woman who had spent 3 years working inside a compromised division towards something she couldn't prove yet, and who had just proven it, and who was now sitting in the wreckage of the evening it had cost to do that. "I need your formal statement. Not tonight. Tonight you need to be medically cleared and away from this building. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., my office. Bring everything you have. I'll be there. Your father." Seo looked at her directly. "I'm going to open a formal review of his case. The payment records you found connecting Hwang to the prosecution. That's grounds for a full misconduct review and case reopening. It's going to take time. It's not going to be simple, but it's going to happen." Ji-ah looked at her. "How long?" "The review? 6 months, realistically, before formal findings. The case reopening could take longer." She paused. "But the outcome, well, given what's in the archive, the outcome isn't in question. I want you to be able to tell him that." Ji-ah nodded once. She didn't trust her voice for anything more complex than that. "Hwang Sung-pil," she said when she had it back, "was arrested 40 minutes ago. Administrative detention pending investigation. His access to the division has been suspended." Seo's voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not satisfaction, something older and more specific, the weight of a score that had been running for 3 years. "He'll try to negotiate. He has information on other networks, other officials. He'll use what he has." She paused. "It doesn't change what he did to your father." "No, it doesn't." They sat in the damaged hall of the Seoul Museum of Modern Art, while Seo's investigators moved through the room documenting and collecting, and the broadcast cameras were finally being shut down, and uniformed officers were managing the remaining guests. And somewhere in the building, Lim Dae-jun was being read his rights in the measured, careful language of a legal system doing, for once, what it existed to do. Ji-ah called her father at 10:47. He answered on the first ring. She understood from this that he'd been awake and waiting and that he'd seen something. The news, the broadcast, someone calling him, and that he'd been sitting somewhere in the family apartment in Mapogu holding his phone. "Appa," she said, "I saw." His voice was careful, and then it wasn't. Ji-ah, yeah. The informal, the childhood address, the one he'd stopped using when she'd turned 20 and they'd both started being so careful with each other. "Are you hurt?" "No." He exhaled, long and slow, the sound of a man letting something go that he'd been holding so long he'd forgotten it was separate from breathing. "It's done," she said. "Hwang is in custody. The Lim accounts are frozen. Seo is opening a review of your case." Silence on the line, then, "How long have you been working on this?" 3 days. A sound that was almost a laugh. 3 days.
A pause. Who helped you? She looked across the ruined room, at the place on the marble floor where she'd knelt with her hands pressed against a white shirt. Someone who owed you a debt, she said, indirectly. Her father was quiet for a moment. Come home, he said, when you're done there. Come home. I will. She sat with her phone after they hung up and let the room be quiet around her for 2 minutes, just 2. Then she stood up and went to do what came next.
The next 6 weeks were not gentle. The depositions were long in the way Seo had promised. 4 sessions spread over 12 days, each one 3 to 5 hours. Ji-ah sitting across from investigators and defense attorneys, and Seo's team with the complete archive documentation in front of her, and answering every question with the particular precision of someone who understood that accuracy was the only protection available and had decided to use it fully. The defense attorneys came at her credibility from the angles Seo had predicted. The irregularities she'd processed without reporting further up the chain. The access she'd had to accounts she'd claimed not to fully understand. The relationship with Kang Min-jae and what it implied about her motivations. She answered everything. She did not conceal the access codes or the authorization records or the flags she'd raised and been told to ignore. She did not conceal the 6 months in New York. She did not conceal the 3 days at Min-jae's estate, or what she'd been told there, or why she'd believed it. She gave the investigators everything and let the record determine what it would. The record determined that she was a cooperating witness with full immunity for her role in the archive extraction. The record also determined, in a forensic accounting review that took 3 months to complete, that her foundation work had been clean in every place she had individual authority and compromised only where she'd been given explicit instruction by Lim Sung-woo's appointed supervisors. Both things were true. The record held both. Hwang Sung-pil negotiated. He gave up 4 officials, 2 presiding judges, and the full architecture of the Organized Crime Division's internal compromise mechanism in exchange for a reduced charge framework that Seo accepted with the pragmatic grimness of someone who understood that some instruments of justice were ugly. He would serve time, not enough time, in the estimation of most people who understood what he'd done. Enough time for the law as it was written rather than as it should have been. Her father's case was formally reviewed and the findings published in the 4th month. The prosecution had been constructed, the evidence had been manufactured, the witnesses had been prepared and paid, the judge had been compromised. Every charge against Yoon Tae-soo, former district prosecutor, was vacated. His legal record was expunged. His pension rights, revoked in the aftermath of the conviction, were restored with interest accumulated across 9 years. Ji-ah was in Seo's office when she received the confirmation. She read the document twice. Then she called her father and read it to him over the phone, word by word, and neither of them spoke for a long time after the last sentence, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the specific silence of 2 people who had been carrying a thing for a long time and were putting it down, together, for the first time. Lim Dae-jun was indicted on 47 counts across 3 jurisdictions. Lim Sung-woo faced 17 counts, including fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy charges relating to the museum event and the broader network. The legal proceedings would take years. The outcome was, as Seo had said, not in question. The Lim Foundation for Cultural Heritage had its license revoked and its assets placed under judicial administration in the 6th week. Ji-ah applied for her own license. Not a foundation, something smaller. A private conservation studio registered under her name in a rented ground-floor space in Bukchon Hanok village, near the old palace walls. She spent 3 weeks sanding and painting the space herself, which was meditative in the specific way of work that was completely physical and produced a visible result. The smell of fresh paint and wood treatment, the particular ache of muscles used in unfamiliar ways, the satisfaction of walls that were the right color because she had chosen the color. She opened in the 3rd month, alone, with 2 clients, a small municipal museum with a collection of late Joseon Celadon that needed assessment, and a private collector with a damaged canvas she'd agreed to evaluate. The work was precise and quiet and entirely hers. She thought about Min-jae. Not continuously, not with the breathless urgency of something unresolved, more the way you thought about someone who existed in a part of your life that was still being understood, returning to it in quiet moments, turning it over, setting it back down. He had been in surgery for 4 hours the night of the gala. The wound was serious in the technical sense. The bullet had fractured a rib and caused significant internal bleeding, and the surgery to repair it was complicated by a pre-existing scar from an older injury that nobody had specifically told her about. He had been in hospital for 11 days. She had not visited during those 11 days, not because she didn't want to, but because the legal proceedings in the first 2 weeks were such that her presence in any situation connected to Kang Min-jae would have been used by the defense teams in ways that served nobody's case. Seo had told her this directly, and she had accepted it with the pragmatic discipline of someone who had learned that timing was a form of care. She had sent one message through O on the 3rd day. 4 words. Seo's filing held. Good. She had received one message back. 3 words. I know. Good. That was the whole of it for 11 weeks. She was in the studio on a Tuesday in the 4th month, bent over the Joseon Celadon with a magnifying lamp and a probe, documenting hairline crazing in the glaze, when she heard the bell above the door. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the notation she was writing, capped the probe, and turned. Min-jae stood in the doorway of her studio in a charcoal coat with the collar turned up against the November cold, which had finally arrived in Seoul with the decisive quality of a season that had made up its mind. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him on the floor of the museum, which was not a high bar, but also different from the estate, from the car, from the alley in the rain. He looked like someone who had been somewhere quiet and come back carrying less than he'd left with. The scar from the surgery was under his shirt, invisible. She knew it was there. She knew the shape of it approximately, having had her hands against the wound for long enough to have formed a reasonable understanding of its geography. She thought about this briefly, and then thought about something else. He looked at the studio. At the work table, the tools laid out with the precision of someone who had their own system. The repaired Celadon pieces arranged along the shelf, the canvas in progress on the secondary easel, the paint samples organized by pigment age on the counter, the 2 chairs by the window that she'd added last week when she admitted to herself that she was building a space for 2 people to sit in. You opened, he said, 3 weeks ago. He looked at her. How is it? Good. She pulled off her magnifying glasses and set them on the table. Quiet. Mine. She paused. Good. He nodded, looking at the shelves. His eyes moved across the work with the attention he gave everything, that quality of looking that was also understanding, registering things and filing them accurately. You look... He stopped. Started again. You look like yourself. She thought about this. I think I might be, she said. Still working on it. He moved into the studio. Not all the way. He stopped near the secondary work table, maintaining the distance of a man who was trying to take accurate stock of the room before he moved further into it. She recognized this as a form of respect, coming from someone who spent most of his life taking whatever space he determined was necessary. I read the proceedings, he said. The Foundation review, your father. I know you did. The testimony you gave, the depositions. He looked at her. It was thorough. It was everything. She held his gaze. They asked about you. The defense teams, 4 sessions, they asked about you in all 4 of them. What did you tell them? The truth. That you gave me information. That I made my own decisions about what to do with it. That the archive pull was my action with my authorization codes and my name on the record. She picked up her probe and set it down again. A tick, something to do with her hands. I didn't protect you, and I didn't implicate you beyond what was factually accurate. Your legal exposure from the gala was managed separately. I know, Seo's team was efficient in that regard. She made a pragmatic decision. She usually does. Ji-ah looked at him. How much of your organization is still intact? He was quiet for a moment. Enough. The people who were feeding information out have been identified and removed. The operations that depended on the Lim network's infrastructure are being restructured. He said it plainly, without euphemism, and without elaboration, which was the register she'd come to understand was his version of honesty. Quieter than before. which I'm told is good. Who told you? My doctor, for 3 months. The corner of her mouth. She didn't stop it. How is the... Fine, he said. Then, after a pause, mostly fine. He moved his left arm slightly, a limited rotation. Certain things are restricted, permanently, probably. She thought about the scars on his hands, the one on his forearm, the collection of old injuries that mapped a life she hadn't fully seen and probably never would. One more added to the collection. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be. It was my choice. It was still a cost. He looked at her steadily. Yes, it was. He didn't minimize it further, just let it be what it was. The studio was quiet. Outside on the Buchen Street, the November cold was keeping foot traffic sparse. A few tourists further up the hill near the old house cluster, the distant sound of a delivery vehicle, wind through the narrow lanes. Ji-ah's studio existed in the particular piece of a space that had been built deliberately, which was different from spaces you simply occupied. She could feel it in the walls she'd painted herself. I didn't know what I was going to say, he said. When I decided to come here, I knew I was going to come here. I didn't know what I was going to say. She looked at him. You don't have to say anything specific. I know, I'm saying it anyway. He looked at the window, at the pale November light, and then back at her. In New York, I told myself I was there for the operation. I told myself what happened after was incidental, something that occurred in the margins of what I was actually doing. He paused. That was not honest. I've had 11 weeks to look at it clearly, and that was not honest. Ji-ah sat down on the edge of the work table, not because her legs were failing, because this felt like a conversation that needed a different quality of attention than standing provided. What was it, honestly? Something I didn't have a category for. He said it simply, not sentimentally, like a man reading from an accurate document. I'd been running operations for 14 years at that point. I understood people in terms of their utility and their risk, and occasionally their loyalty. You didn't fit those categories. You talked about a 10th century glaze restoration technique for 40 minutes, and I didn't want you to stop. He paused. I didn't have a category for that. Ji-ah looked at him. The cold outside, the light, the man in the charcoal coat who had appeared in an alley in the rain and changed the geometry of her life and then waited 11 weeks to stand in her doorway, looking like someone who was trying to be honest about something for which honest was not a well-worn groove. You should have told me, she said. In New York. What you were. Yes. I would have... She stopped. I don't know what I would have done. I know. That's partly why I didn't. That's not a good enough reason? No, it isn't. He met her eyes. I know it isn't. She held the look for a moment. Then, I need you to understand something. The studio. This space is mine. The work is mine. My father's case is resolved and my family is intact, and I know who I am in a way I didn't for a very long time. She paused. I'm not going back to any version of existing inside someone else's structure. Not yours, not anyone's. That's not available. I know, he said. I mean it. I know you mean it. He looked at her with those dark eyes that had never been simple, that she had spent 3 years turning over in her memory, trying to categorize, and had finally stopped trying to categorize. I'm not asking you for that. I'm not asking you for anything. A pause. I came here because I wanted to see that you were... He stopped, started again. I wanted to see the studio. Ji-ah looked at him for a long moment, at the careful distance he was maintaining, at the way he stood in her space without trying to take it up, at all the things that were true about him that she had no clean way to hold simultaneously. The violence and the precision and the specific way he had looked at her on the floor of the museum with a bullet wound in his side and said, I was listening. Do you drink tea? She said. A pause. Yes. There's a kettle in the back. She stood up from the table. I was about to stop for the day anyway. She went to the back room to fill the kettle and heard him move further into the studio behind her. Heard the quiet sound of him looking at the shelves, at the celadon pieces, at the canvas on the easel. She filled the kettle and set it on the small burner and stood for a moment in the back room with her hands on the counter and breathed. In and out, all the way through. She brought 2 cups out. He was standing near the shelf of restored pieces, looking at a small bowl she'd finished 3 days ago. A Goryeo celadon, deep green, a crack along the rim repaired with the Japanese technique of filling fractures with a visible seam rather than hiding them. The repair was part of the object now. It didn't pretend the damage hadn't happened. He looked at the repair for a long time without speaking. "I started learning that technique last year," she said, setting the cups on the window table. "It makes more sense to me now than it used to." He looked at her. Something in his face was quieter than she'd seen it. He sat down in one of the chairs by the window. She sat in the other. Outside, Seoul was settling into its November evening, the light going amber at the edges, the old houses of Bukchon casting long shadows down the hill, the city beyond them beginning its nightly illumination, layer upon layer of light that had accumulated over decades and didn't know how to stop. Min-jae held his cup with both hands. The scars on his knuckles caught the last of the light. He looked out the window at the city, and she looked at him, looking at it, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence between them had a different quality than all the silences before it. Not the silence of withheld information, of strategies being calculated, of 2 people trying to determine what was safe to want from each other. Something more like the silence between people who had survived something together, and were still, carefully, finding out what they were to each other now that the surviving part was done. The kettle was quiet. The light changed. Ji-ah drank her tea and looked at the street outside. At the cold and the amber light, and the occasional figure moving along the Bukchon lane, bundled against November, going wherever November people went. She thought about the night in the rain, about running with nowhere to go and colliding with something that turned out to be more complicated than a stranger and less terrible than she'd feared and harder to put down than she'd expected. She thought about her father's voice reading the exoneration document, about the specific sound of a man putting down something he'd carried for 9 years. Some things you carried until you didn't anymore. Some things you carried differently. "I'm not in a hurry," she said. It wasn't directed at him exactly. More at the room, at the November street, at the version of herself that was still learning what it meant to choose slowly. Min-jae looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something in the direction of one that was more honest than a smile would have been. "Neither am I," he said. Outside, Seoul went on doing what it had always done, holding its many layers of history and light and damage and repair, all the broken things and the carefully tended things, all the lives that had been built and rebuilt inside its geography without the city pausing to acknowledge the cost of any of it. Inside the small studio in Bukchon, a woman who had learned the difference between the life that was given to her and the life she was capable of choosing sat in a chair by the window she had painted herself, in a room that smelled like cedar and turpentine and old glaze, and drank tea with a man who was learning, with considerable difficulty, what it meant to be somewhere without a war to manage. The light faded. Neither of them was in a hurry. That was enough for now. That was, in fact, more than either of them had been given in a very long time, and they both knew the value of it, which was the kind of knowledge that only came from having gone without.